So we get asked a lot, where our pigments come from? Now, while we make all the paint here in our factory at Rhodes in Sydney, we get our pigments from literally all around the world. Now, the reason they come from all around the world is because there are certain places within the world where a particular chemical or compound is more prolific, and so therefore that's where the pigments are made, close to the source. For instance, French ultramarine blue, as the name suggests, comes from France, and that's where still the best supply comes from, where it was first developed more than 200 years ago. We refer to pigments as though they're sort of one type of thing, but really, from a chemical perspective, they vary massively. So you've got inorganic pigments, and you've got synthetic pigments, and then you've got synthetic organic pigments, and organic pigments. You've got a whole lot of different things. Probably doesn't worry us too much when we're actually using the pigments in paint. However, transparency and light fastness are certainly two things that will definitely have a bearing on what paints to use and when we're actually using them. So transparency, as the name suggests, will refer to the actual pigment and whether it, on basically a nano level, is transparent. In other words, looks a little bit like a crystal, or whether it's opaque, looks maybe something like you could think of a billiard ball that's completely solid and the light reflects off it rather than through it, which it does in a transparent pigment. A semi-transparent pigment, or at least a semi-transparent colour, there's two different types. You have literally a pigment which is semi-transparent, so in other words not as transparent as a transparent pigment, or indeed you may have a mixture of both transparent and opaque pigments, which then gives you a semi-transparent paint. Now, just to completely turn all of that on its head, if we're looking at phthalocyanean blue or phthalo blue, that is a very strong staining pigment, but it's classified as transparent. On the other hand, when we look at ultramarine blue, which is an opaque pigment, however, it's really weak. So in the paint, when you're painting these two colours out, you could be forgiven for thinking that phthalo blue was actually an opaque pigment, or colour at least, and ultra blue was transparent, although they are actually the other way around. Another important factor with the pigments you're using and in the colours that you're using is light fastness. In other words, the ability for the pigment not to fade when exposed to light. Now, there are various different ratings. The two main ones used now are an American Standard ASTM rating and the blue wool scale that mainly comes from the UK. Really, any professional artist grade paint should be using ASTM 1 or 2 only, or blue wool scale 8. In other words, very light fast pigments. And obviously you want your work to be light fast so that it doesn't fade in the next 10 or 20 years. For instance, fluorescent pigments, as bright and as wonderful as they are, will fade very, very quickly in a matter of only 1 or 2 years, sometimes months. It just depends on the pigment, how much is there and how thick the coating is and that sort of thing. But you certainly will only get a short period in comparison to a light fast pigment, which should be well in excess of 100 years, or 250 years for an ASTM 1 pigment. You'll notice on our tubes and jars we'll have a series number, 1 through to 7 and above. That series, sometimes people think, has to do with the quality of the paint. It's not the quality, but it's actually the cost of the pigment, the particular pigment in that colour. So some colours, and some based on the pigment, are very expensive to produce, both because either their raw materials are expensive and or the process is expensive. The third factor is just how much of that material is produced on a global scale, And there's a lot of colours that really just us as artists use. And so on a global scale, not a lot of pigment is produced compared to, say, something that's used for car coatings or house coatings, like, for instance, titanium dioxide. And so when not much is produced, obviously the price is higher. Something like titanium dioxide is produced all around the world, and it's really quite cheap in comparison to a lot of the other colours, and so therefore is a Series 1 price. So I hope that brief summary has answered a few questions that you might have had on pigments. And do remember, if you have a question, please just email us. Our email is down in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe.